I started in 2004, and I just really love the sort of movement of water and the energy that it's creating that. So there's a few pictures from here, but this one on the left here is one of my favorites by a long way. This was in Rio. Rio was an incredibly complex tide area, and there was quite a bit of rubbish in the sea, you probably all heard. But more than that, there was these beautiful tides that would just collide into each other. So we've got lots of movement of water in this photo on the left here. I hope you can see my mouse. And you can see this sort of softer, lighter, mirrored patch here, and then this harder area over here. And what's beautiful about this is these are two bodies of water that are just hitting each other, completely colliding and causing this sort of line down here. And we're going to cover some of this detail tonight. But that's why I like it, and that's why I got involved. Okay, so why does it happen? Why do we get these tides? Now, you guys are all from Lymington, and everybody, all the other juniors around the UK always look at anyone down in the South Coast and think those guys are great at tides. But really, what does that mean? So this is going to cover some of the detail of why you guys are good in tide already. And the reason really is that you've experienced it. You've been out sailing in Lymington. There's a lot of tide there. Hayling Island, there's a lot. I'm from Cowes, and there's a heap over here as well. So you've experienced it, and in that experience comes knowledge, and this is going to support that knowledge. Okay, so why do we have tides in the first place? Why does this body of water keep coming in and keep going out? Has anybody got any ideas? Let's start on that. You may have to unmute or hit the chat. Mars, I can't see the chat actually, by the way.
The moon?
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. The gravity of the moon. And the moon is very small, but it's really close. It's really close to us. And because of that, it exerts the gravity and pulls water towards it. It's really as simple as that, actually. There's a two-way force, in fact, between the Earth and the moon. But the moon's gravity is enough to overcome and pull the body of water towards it. Okay. Now, this next slide we've got actually goes into just a little bit more detail of why that is. So you can see this bulge that's on the moon's side here. Okay. Now that bulge is the water that's attracted by the moon, and then the Earth spins underneath that. Okay. So it happens twice a day round here, and towards the end of the presentation too, we'll talk about why, if you want to try and understand why there's a bulge on the second half of this. It's slightly more complex, but importantly, the moon's gravity pulls this body of water to one side, and then we rotate underneath it. Okay, so we're going to talk about a bit of language that goes on. It's classic in sailing. We get all this different language that happens. You know, there's Vang, Cunningham, and all these things that none of your mates who sail have any idea know what you're talking about. And tide actually adds a little bit more to that as well. So I'm going to use some of this terminology, and I kind of want you to understand it and own it a little bit as well. So here we go. We've got tide, tide stream, and current. Now, in loose terms, you're going to find everybody right through your life will refer to the flow of water under all of these three terms. But actually, they do mean something slightly different. And I'm going to explain why, so you have the absolute knowledge of what it is. So we'll start with tide. Oh, somebody else is joining. Hold on. There we go. Tide describes the vertical movement of water. That's the height of tide. So when we go down to Lymington, and sometimes you go, and when you launch, the water's all the way at the bottom of the slipway, and when you come back, it's right at the top. Now that's called tide. That's the vertical movement of water. Tide stream is the horizontal movement of water, and that's what you and I all care about. You know, it's how much is flowing around where we're sailing. So that's tide stream. And then current is actually other forces that create water to move. And so typically it's easy to think about that as a river flowing into the sea, if you like. I mean, there are many different types of current caused by different forces, but current, the easiest one to understand is a river for it coming into the sea. Okay, so three. Hello, there we go. Okay, so our next one is high and low water. Sorry, the next one is flood and ebb. My computer went funny there. Flood and ebb. So this describes water coming into an area and leaving an area, so that we can think about the Solent because we're all here. If it's empty or low water, then it's got to fill and it's got to flood. So the way I'd like to remember this is actually to think of the land being flooded by water coming in. So you just kind of have to remember the flood and the ebb. So the flood, water's coming in and flooding the area, and the ebb is when it's leaving. Okay, high and low water, that describes the vertical movement, how much it actually moves. And in some places in the world, like the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, they get 38-foot tides over there. We get about 4 or 5 meters over here. Good to mix up a bit of measurements. So so they get huge over there. Now that's due to the way the land mass is sitting. It's very coincidental of how it all happens, but they get very big rises of tide and very big rates of tide as well. So around here, typically we get between 3 and 4 knots of tide that you'll experience down in Lymington, and that can vary between a spring and a neap tide, which is our next piece of language. So that's when actually we go back to that moon picture. If the moon actually happens to line up with the sun as well, we get this sort of double effect of gravity. And the sun is obviously a huge body, huge mass, but it's a very, very, very long way away. So its influence is a little bit less. But when it does line up with the moon, it's just enough to give us that extra bit of water pull around the planet. And we call that a spring tide. And when it's not lined up and it's completely opposite, we call that a neap tide. Okay, course over ground, really important, but I'm actually going to address that later. Okay, but course over ground, COG, is definitely very important to us. Wind against tide. Now you've definitely seen this when you've left Lymington Harbour, and you look out to sea, and it's something coming in, and you look out to sea, and it looks really rough. I'm sure you've all seen that. And that's because in the classic southwesterly breeze that sets up outside the entrance with the tide going straight into it, we get this big sea generated, and it becomes quite rough, particularly when the wind's really strong. So that's wind against tide, and we'll come back to that one a bit later on as well. Okay, then we've got sailing wind. Just need to move that. Then we've got sailing wind, and towards the end I'm going to cover this as well. This is really important. This is the wind that we all experience whilst we're sailing. We have tide line. Okay, so tide line, if you look at this picture that's with this, you can see this is my drone shot of Cowes looking down towards Lymington. Lymington's just here, and you've got you can see this very clearly. There's a difference in color. There's a difference in this line that's tracing, this white line tracing right the way through. And the reason we get these is because there's 2 different bodies of water going in different directions or the same direction. And we call this a tide line. Where they meet, it lands up with a line, and it can catch debris. We have to be very careful sailing through these areas because you can get weed. There's a huge problem in Rio. One of the biggest sessions we had was just talking about how to manage sailing through a tide line and avoiding any debris that was in the water. And there was a lot in Rio. But around here, we get a lot of weed, can be the problem. And some years are worse than others. So tide lines, another piece of language. Now, visual cue is something you see, you see this throughout sailing, actually. And we use these a lot in when we talk about tides and winds. And I'm sure you may have heard this term before, but if not, I'm going to be using it tonight. And it really means the things you see and what they mean to you as you sail through an area. Okay, the visual cue. Right, so now That's quite a lot of talking, but here we go. We're going to come to sort of around our way, if you like, what happens around our way. So here we have a picture of United Kingdom, Ireland and France, and probably for another 22 days we're in Europe and then we leave, but I don't think the tide's going to change. So it's the flood tide, if you remember back to that language, is the tide that comes in and floods the land. So that's our incoming tide. And round here, this is what happens in the English Channel. It comes from the west, from down here, and it comes and travels around this way and moves up through to the east. Okay, that's our flood tide picture. That's the big picture. Now, if we look locally to Lymington, we can see how that sort of comes into the soil. It's quite a crude picture, this, and you can see it pours in through Hurst here, and it tracks its way into the Solent as the height of tide rises. So here's our first bit of learning, and it's a piece of knowledge that you need to bank and just keep forever in your sort of front of your brain, because it's really important. So the tide stream flows fastest in deepest water. Okay. Now what that means is, this is a chart, okay, and we've got this white area here is the deepest water, and you can see it's been carved out by the water, in fact, coming in and out, and it's pretty deep. These are in meters, so what have we got there? 25 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters here. It's very deep down this end, and the water likes to find the path of least resistance, so it flows through here really fast. And then as we get closer and closer to the beach, it has more resistance because it's shallower, and it flows a lot slower until we get over to the mud flats here. I think that's Oxley Lake, isn't it, right there? Well, you guys must know this area super well. And it does flow at high water across here, but as you move away from the beach, it starts to flow faster and faster. Okay, now, if you go to a new venue that you don't know, with this piece of knowledge, you can assess how fast the tide will flow, because typically, if you're stood on a beach, as you move away from the beach out to sea, it gets deeper. That's a fairly typical path. And of course, you now know that the stream flows fastest in the deeper water. So as you move away from the shallows, it will just get faster and faster. Okay, so that principle is universal. It works really well, and you can make strong assessments at any new area you go sailing in. It really helps if you can look at a chart before you go out into a new area. It's also quite interesting. The ebb tide does the opposite. Again, flows super fast in the deep water, and then it gets softer and softer as we go inshore. Okay. So this is Ruby and her terror, and she's been very good at offering up her services to show us how to and how not to do things. And here is this is in the Solent, so there's plenty of tide going on here. And my first question to you is, can anybody see from just this picture which way the tide is flowing? Anybody? I can't see the chat, Miles. I don't know whether you can.
From left to right.
From the left side to the right. Okay, that is absolutely spot on. And where we're getting this from, there's very little in this picture to tell us how it actually, why that is, except this mark, right? So the mark's here, and you can see, and I'm going to play the video in a second, and you can see just at the front of the mark here that it's built, the water's building up a little bit. And then towards the back, there's like a shadow here. Now, this is a skill set you need to have. And you're probably one of those things where you're used to just doing it at Lymington, but maybe not consciously looked at it. So I kind of want you, when you next go sailing and from now on, just start looking at marks and posts in the river. So when you go walking with your parents, you take the dog for a walk it down by the river and just have a look and try and get a really good understanding of which way it's flowing and if you can, how fast it's flowing. So you can have a competition with your mum or dad if they've got half an idea, and just say, I think that's flowing at 1.5 knots or something like that. It's a great skill set to be able to sail past a mark and know the rate and the direction. Let's just play this video. You can see the water just building up at the front and the shadow sort of traced down the back. Okay, so here we have, here's Ruby coming up in her terror. It's very light winds and a little bit of tide. It's not going that quickly actually, but it's enough to give us a good demonstration. So as she approaches it, she's got a nice ley line. She's going to get round this mark, but it's quite slow to act. And then if I just keep playing a little further, it's pretty slow going. Now, as she gets to about here, I'm not speaking to her, but I'm guessing what she's thinking here, that she doesn't want to crash into this big metal buoy. It can't be a good thing. Also, you're not allowed to under the rules of sailing, and also ABP don't like you crashing into their marks. This one's an SCRA, but you mustn't hit marks fundamentally. So, and they're big and metal, so they're pretty daunting. And as we keep creeping forward, she obviously gets a little bit concerned that she's getting close. Okay, so she was at a nice upwind, perfect upwind angle, but as she got close, she got a bit spooked and starts to head up. And of course, if you pinch a little bit and you slow your boat down, there's a dramatic effect. Okay, so she's almost stopped, and that's really hard, particularly when there's tide, because you're not actually going anywhere. You are sailing through the water, but you're not going anywhere over the ground. So it's a really big deal to keep the boat moving, you know, in all conditions. In fact, even when there isn't any tide, you've got to keep going, of course, but particularly when you have a situation like this. So she's come up to the buoy, slightly pinched. She's thinking, oh, I'll give myself a bit more room, or I can pinch to get round it maybe. Well, actually, it can be a huge mistake in tide. If the tide was in the opposite direction here, you could almost pinch head to wind, you know, just go head to wind and drift down with the tide and get yourself round. But it's not the case when the tide's against. Here she just recognizes the problem and puts the bow back down again to a normal upwind angle and starts to creep forward again. Okay, and again, the next part here is there's quite a long way to go past this mark before you can actually round it and bear away and go. And then a second you do get the bow down, cross the tide, the foil hits that, bam, you get swept down and off you go. Now, interestingly, here I noted that she hadn't let the vang off or the Cunningham, which you guys would normally do when you get to the top mark. But I think she was concentrating on not hitting this metal buoy, which is probably a good thing. Okay. Right, so moving on. This is a sort of fairly straightforward picture. And I've got a few questions for you to run here to see if you can pick this up. So we've got a course, we've got Mark 1 at the top here. The wind's coming down the page, the tide's coming with it. We've got a start line and Mark 2 at the bottom. Quite Lymington, actually, this, isn't it? With the land on the right and the slightly deeper water on the left. This is kind of very much what you experience. Now, does anybody have an idea what grey boat should be doing here as the quickest way to get to Mark 1? It's a beat, clearly. Anybody got an idea of what grey should do here?
Should you go over the right-hand side?
Over towards this area over here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly that. So it should tack here and start working inshore. Okay, now we call this a strategy. Okay, so it's the strategy here very clearly would be that it's very light tide on the inside here and it's heavy 1.2 knots on the outside. So they're going to experience a big gain if they come inshore here. Okay, but then what should they do from here? Anybody got that? what should we do from this right hand boat? Should they come into the shore and back out again?
So there's a few on the chat saying short tacks up the right hand side, beat up the right hand side.
Thanks, Mars. I can't see that chat. Thanks, everyone. That's great. Yeah, so exactly this. Just short tacks up here. Now, you do a tack, we lose 1.5 lengths on a tack. So is it worth doing those number of tacks? Well, in this scenario, definitely, because you've got so much tide if you come out into this deeper water. There is a danger, of course, of sailing inshore here. Anybody got the danger?
You might stop in the tacks or you might run aground.
That's really good. Stopping in the tacks, yes, we've got to do some really nice tacks here. This is why we practice our tacks, is because doing accurate tacking when you've got a scenario like this becomes a very high priority. And running aground, absolutely, it's a nightmare if you run aground, but particularly down in Lymington, funny enough, because there's those mud flats, right? So if you run aground, you might get some mud on this. You might get off, which might take you too long. You also might land up with a lump of mud on the bottom of the foil, which you can't get off unless you capsize. So, or over time, it might wash itself off. But the sheer time it takes just to get off of the being run aground is too much. So we've got to be really careful and mindful of that. Watch other boats, know the area well, those sorts of things. Okay, so here's a strategy that we've moved the tide now in the opposite direction, same rates. So so our strategy here, let's go back. So the strategy here would clearly be the opposite way. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you go and do your starts at an area, let's say we go to Weymouth for the first time, unfortunately, you don't have these really nice arrows everywhere on the sea telling you what the rate of the tide is. So it becomes quite difficult, or certainly harder, to gauge where there's more or less tide. We can go back, if we've got a beach involved, like we have here, or land involved, then we've got that principle right in our pockets that it runs fastest in deepest water. So if we do the two things we've learned so far, if we observe around the start boat and the pin, if we can observe which way the tide is flowing, here it's going to be flowing this way on that pin. So you'd see that. And without all these red arrows on the sea, you should be able to deduce that it will be a lot softer on one side, a lot firmer on the other, a lot faster running on the other. So the strategy here would clearly be to come out onto this port lay and take advantage of the faster running area in this side. Okay, so this is our strategy. Now our next slide just adds a bit of complexity to that. So let's wind it back to, this is sort of a slightly different direction, very Lymington again here. Here's the land here, the breeze is sort of coming down the page. Start line, mark 1, mark 2. Now, without any tide whatsoever, our ley line would sit here. Okay, so if I add the component of tide here, what will that do to our ley line?
Take you to the right.
The actually would move you as a boat. If we're sailing up here, it would be carrying you to the right hand side. That's absolutely right. But if this is our ley line, if there's no tide here at all and we tacked on this lay, we would get round. But with the tide pushing us really hard here, what do you think happens to this ley line?
You know what the ley line
Gets
is?
moved, yeah.
Exactly, it gets moved. It gets moved, and I'm going to show you the example here. It gets moved to here really early. It comes up way earlier. So here we've got two boats. Look, one's gone to where the old ley line is. We're sailing in this tide. We've got 0.8 of a knot underneath us. We're sailing in this tide, and they've gone to where they're usually used to having a ley line. So they've gone to there, and blue's approaching where the actual ley line is because of the tidal component. So what should blue do here?
Should he tack?
Tack.
Yeah, exactly right. So if they simultaneously tack here, blue is going to arrive at mark 1 before. And so the reason for that is grey will tack here. It'll look good initially, but then of course the course will go this way up here, and they'll end up having to bear away. And there's a double loss here, okay? One, if they've gone too far, they're sailing too much distance, but then they've actually got to bear away into the tie, okay? So they've got even further to go still. So it's actually a huge loss. Now, quite importantly here is it's really, as usual, it's not good to get to ley lines too early. We know this, right? We don't want to go all the way to one corner and try and lay it in one. And it's very true in a tidal situation because it's so hard to find this ley line here. So you're much better off dividing it up and coming closer here and tacking much closer to the buoy, doing more tacks until you're absolutely sure you know where that ley line is. In fact, in this scenario, our strategy would be to come out to this left-hand side anyway and take this extra gain up here. Okay.
Graham, can I just add one thing to this slide? I mean, this is a perfect replica almost of what a lot of you who sailed in Youth Week at the Royal, and we were in Oxy Lake with the Oppies and the Terrors. And this is what was happening nearly every day. And some of you got your ley line about right, and some of you went to where you thought the ley line should be, and you ended up sailing big banana shapes and getting massively overstood over the mark. And it's all because of this tide, and it's a really good, this almost shows exactly what was happening. So for those of you who did that event, it's a really good visualization on exactly what the problem you were having. Thanks, Graham.
Great. Okay, so now we move to the same scenario. We've got round the mark 1. Now we've got to get to mark 2. And first of all, no tide at all. What's the best way to get from, if you're sailing blue, what's the best way to get to mark 2? There's one.
Straight go down.
Straight is the word. Straight is absolute. I couldn't see who said that, but well done. That's exactly right. Now, the reason straight is good is because it's the shortest distance. Okay, that's why straight is really good here. If we wiggle about a lot, or we head up, or we luff each other, then those two boats sail extra distance and slow down. Sometimes you need to do it to protect your air, to stay in front. But if you're sailing on your own, just a simple principle, straight line is the fastest route. So given that with no tide, what happens when I put tide there and I still point straight at this mark? What's going to happen to me?
Left.
Sorry, I missed that.
You're gonna hit the committee boat, or like, yeah.
Right. You're on the right line there, exactly. So if I take my bow and I just look at this mark, you've got to spot it early, by the way. It's really important always to find a leeward mark super early so we can aim for it and don't sail extra distance. So let's say we're sailing down here, dead down, and I keep pointing at this mark, but the tidal component is, you're quite right, it's pushing me down towards the committee boat here. It's pushing me this way. But if I keep pointing at it, it looks like I am going straight for it. But in actual fact, the course you sail is more like that. Okay, now that means you've sailed more distance than you needed to. Okay, so how do we get over that? The answer is absolutely. Go on, sorry.
Head slightly to the left of the course.
Head slightly to the left, as this picture has got it. Yes, well done. So, so here's our boat, and I've now headed into this tide just a little bit. Okay, and so that's our heading. So that's another piece of terminology for us. That's the heading. That's the heading that the boat is pointing. Okay, not where it's going. That is heading. Now, I said to you earlier, I'm going to pick up this language thing, and that's something I want you to really try and embed there. That's the heading of the boat. So our next bit is, given that our heading is that way, we should now sail a straight line towards this mark. So anybody got a guess what that might be called? Okay, I'll let you in. So that is called course over ground. Okay. Now these words are really important to try and understand and keep hold of, because when you then reference it with your coach, you can really tune into the bit you got right or the beat you got wrong. So heading is the direction the boat's pointing, and the course over the ground is the course that it's actually taking. Okay, so so to head straight to this mark to sail the shortest distance with this tidal component, we need to turn slightly this way, and then we'll sail a straight line. Now, there is a really good method of ensuring that you stay on a really straight line. Okay, does anybody know what that might be? Lymington sailors, I'm sure you do.
Transit.
Pick a point on the land.
Pick a point on the land. Exactly. Now, this is why we become really good sailors when we sail in tide, because you can get this all over the place. Actually, and even to a point you can even see it in some of the bigger lakes where they get some movement in the lakes. Okay, they do get a little bit of surface movement, and so if you can just learn to work with transits, you will be very strong indeed. I'm just going to move that there. Okay, so a transit. So we're going to cover transits right now. So we all surely know what they are. Okay. So a transit ultimately means picking a point on the shore, which in my diagram on the left here, we've got the mark here, and we've got this point on the shore. I've conveniently drawn a post there, but it could be anything actually. It could just be a bush that's on the shore, or it could even be another mark that's close to it. Okay, it could even be another mark that's just close to it right here. There's plenty of those down in Lymington, plenty of those fishermen's buoys and bits and pieces like that. So pick up something on the shore or a mark in the foreshore. Okay, now the idea here is that you line your transit up like I've drawn here. You line your transit up, and so this is actually drawn now as though you and I are all sat in this boat, and we are pointing towards the mark. There's the mark there, and there it is in the foreground, and then the post is in the background, and our tidal component's hitting us from the starboard side because we're on this run here. Okay, so we've got to keep those in line, and if we keep those in line, we actually sail a very straight course. So if that happens, what have I done wrong?
You haven't picked the right transit.
Yes.
You're losing transit.
I'm losing the transit. Exactly right. I'm losing the transit. So these two fixed points, because that mark there is fixed, it's anchored to the bottom. This mark here is fixed because it's on the shore. And now I was looking at it like this, and now I'm looking at it like this. And therefore, I've made a mistake. I haven't sailed down the transit. I've started doing that wiggly line. Okay, so I correct myself. And in this case, I need to turn to starboard to correct myself. But if I carry on doing that and that happens, then you can see I've kind of done the same thing, but now on the other side. So I've gone too far to the right and the transit slipped the other way. Now, this does take a bit of practice when you're out there, but it's really worth doing. Grab your coach, try and get them to explain it. Grab your mums and dads. When you go for a walk around town, right by the river, you've got plenty of great stuff to do. You can look at a mark, try and judge which way the tide is flowing. You can pick two lampposts and try and get a transit to understand those. And they need to be a fair distance away, but it's really worth doing. And then when you get on the water in your boat, whenever you sail past a mark on the way out, try and judge which way the tide's going, try and judge its rate, and so on. Okay, so Now we're running out of time here. So some venue information, right? So we get it's very well published high water times, and you can get them. These are my two favorite ones: Proudman Oceanography and Easy Tide. They're both available on the website, and it's just mathematics actually of where that moon's going to be, but it tells us where the high water times are, what they are. And so on my diagram just here, this is a copy paste from Easy Tide, and you can see this is actually just today. So the high waters were first thing this morning. This is Portsmouth, and later in the afternoon, and then you can relate this information to a tidal atlas. So down in Lymington, if you've gone out and it's a pretty big race, it would be good to know whether the tide's coming in and what time it's going to change, and you can glean all that information from a tidal atlas like these at the bottom here, and there's plenty for your area, and then you just get your high. They all reference high water time. Okay, and that's that there. Okay, any questions to that point? If you think of a question subsequently, you can always contact Hugh, and he'll pick up some of the points. So now the next thing I've got is just a little bit more advanced. So if you think you're done and you'd like to break, I know it's already, and you've had a long day at school, it's 6:10 already, so feel free to jump off. But if you want to hang on and stay in there, then please do. Everyone's very welcome to hear the next part if you want to.
There was one question that popped up in the chat a bit earlier on from Lottie, which was how fast can the tides flow? So, I mean, I was thinking specifically around Lymington or around the Solent.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, the Ushant and around there, we can get 7-8 knot tides, currents. But just around here,
yeah.
What sort of speeds do you typically see in the currents?
Yeah, that's like my favorite question. There you go. So, yeah. Now down in Lymington, you've got quite a bit. It flows faster down there than it does down in the eastern Solent, around off Portsmouth. Portsmouth Harbour's quite quick, but there's a pinch point. There's a pinch point at Hurst Narrows, and I've got a nice video to show you next, actually, which will explain some of the reasons why that happens. But that flows up to 4.2, 4.3 knots, and maybe a touch more on those really big spring tides that we get.
So you wouldn't get your terror through there upwind then? And
it's yes, it's hard to get a terror or an oppie. I mean, they go, what do they do? 3.8 knots, something like that. So you do have to pick your moment when you go through there. But yeah, so we get pretty fast tides here, and it's really good for us. Sailing in tide produces the best sailors in the world, and you've got that great opportunity down there where you are in Lymington, as have Hayling Island. Got some great stuff there. It really focuses the mind to do a good job. It's a great question. I like that. So this next bit is sailing wind. Now you wouldn't think that wind would play much of a part being tide, but a tide talk, but actually it's a hugely significant. So here we've got two boats in that picture that you saw earlier with a 10 knot breeze blowing. And here we are. So if I add the tidal component here, you can see that grey has got himself a nice little 1/2 knot tide inshore, and blue has got 1.2 knots of tide offshore. Now, sailing wind is a description, it's a piece of language, but it's a description of, imagine you're on that boat, it's the wind that you're experiencing. It's not this 10 knots up here, and it's not the direction either. The sailing wind is a component of this wind and the wind that you're generating. Now imagine if you're you're walking to school tomorrow and there's absolutely not a breath of wind, and if you broke into a run, you would feel wind in your face. So that's the same as sailing. As we're moving along, that wind is hitting you, and that's a component of wind. Now you have to add that to this wind up here, this 10 knots, and the direction, and you land up with sailing wind. Okay, now it's quite important, and it becomes even more important later on when we add some other issues to it. But principally, you can see the gain here. If this blue boat's tacked away from the start line, or must be lap 2, tacked away from the start line, has got himself into 1.2 knots of tide. They've got that tide taking them into the breeze. So they're feeling more wind than 10 knots. Okay. They're feeling 11.2-ish knots. And inshore here, they've got half a knot taking them into the breeze. Okay. So they're feeling 10.5 knots. So not only are they getting this tidal gain, they're actually receiving more wind for it as well. So they should be going even slightly faster. Okay. And that's what's significant about understanding the effect that tide has on your wind. And it's a big deal. Okay, so I've got visual cue. Sorry, yeah, I did add this. Is that you can see this when you've got the tide pushing into the wind like this, we have a visual cue. And that's if we stood down on the shore here or sail about down here, if we looked over here, you would see a much choppier, more waves. And that's a visual cue that something else is going on. And it's really important with tides. We showed you that picture right at the very start when we talked about Rio, and that there was a very smooth area in one place, and then it was quite rough or a bit rougher over on the other side of that tide line. Okay, so those are our visual cues, and they do mean things. So when you see them, you can understand that there's a change about to happen, and maybe it's a gain or maybe it's a loss. And sometimes you just need to just take that information back to your coach and say, I didn't quite understand what that line was. Could you explain it? Okay, that's a visual cue. So this last video I've got, it's 6:15 already. I'm so sorry, guys. This last video I've got is actually of Bembridge Harbour here on the Isle of Wight. And it's got everything that happens in, why this video is good is because everything that happens in a small scale is the same as a bigger scale. The same sort of principles apply. So I'm just going to play it quickly and I'll pause it as we walk through. There's my bike. So here's this is like a lake over here that fills up, and there's a causeway here. It's a nice walk, and there's a bridge here. And here's the water running in under it. Have a look at that there. So you can see here, and you'll see it in a second when I play the rest of the video, that the faster stream is running through here, which is the deepest water area. Okay, so that really underpins our principle. We've got the edges running quite slowly in the shallower water. We've even got some nice little back eddy stuff going on over here. I'm going to play a bit. Oh, sorry. Now there's a little bit of dirt on the water, which actually is helping us here. There it is, pouring in. And as we come over this side, there you can see these bubbles here are stationary. And in fact, if you look closely, they're actually moving this way slightly, and then they join the flow background here. And there's even small little whirlpool things going on. Can you see that? And this really is what happens on a bigger scale in the Solent, you know, it's the same detail. See, it's flowing really fast just there. Then on the other side, we talked about Hurst. We talked about Hurst and that pinch point by Hurst Castle. I'm sure you've all been for a walk up there and you look over to the island and you can see that tide just ripping through that area. And this is the reason that it happens. As soon as you've got a big volume of water trying to get through a small gap, you watch what happens here. You can see it kind of accelerating. It almost looks stretched as it comes into this area. Okay, and you can see these bubbles really showing that nicely. See how that's accelerating down in this part here. There you go, and there's Bembridge. Any questions? I'm sure there'll be plenty. And if you think of something later, then please do fire it to Hugh, and we can try and answer it.
Graham, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely awesome. I'm sure everybody has learnt a lot. There's a lot to take away from that. There really is. I think if you get a chance to watch that video back, we'll get the recording up online. I think the more times you watch that, the more you'll pick things up all the time. I think all the parents that were in the room have probably picked things up there as well. You're really, really lucky to have had Graham come in and and give us this chat, because he is the fountain of all Solent knowledge. Big thumbs up from the Goslings there.
Yes, nice to see you all there. Look at that.
Yeah.
Really good. Yeah.
So, I mean, for this weekend, even if you just put a few of those things into your head for this weekend when you're out in your coaching sessions, and you try and work out, you know, what time is high water? Is it going to be flooding or is it going to be ebbing? What are the visual cues you can look out for on the water? Can you see those tide lines? Can you check around a buoy as you're sailing out? You know, you sail past those yellow markers in Lymington River. They'll give you a good idea of which way the current's flowing out of the river or into the river. And then as you get further out into the Solent, which way it's going as you sail past the buoys. And then another good bit of practice is to get some transits done. You know, pick up a point on the land or pick up two of the channel markers and see if you can hold a transit and see what happens when you slide either side of them. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the coaching group before this weekend and see what you can do. But Graham, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you from everybody here in Lymington. It's
super. It's a real pleasure. And remember, try and do those practices when you take the dog for a walk. You know, you can learn a lot by doing that.
There we go. Right, everybody. I mean, that's it for this week. I'm sure Hugh's back next week. If you have got any questions, then pop them to Hugh, myself, or put them in the chat now. Leo says now they'll all want a dog.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham.
Nice
Thank
one.
you.
Leo's just had a shower.
Thank you. First time in a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice one, Graham.
What a Mars, yeah, great. What a nice crowd, eh? They are good.
That
Very
was
nice.
awesome. That really was. That was a really good one. I picked up on Sailing Wind right at the start for them, but only just gave it a brief intro, and that was just a great slide. So, yeah, thanks for that. That was
Nice gentle introduction to some of those concepts, eh?
Yeah, really good. Jeremy?
Graham, thank you very much.
Hey,
I'm sure they'll ask you back again.
Oh, well, that's always a good. That's the ultimate compliment, isn't it? If you get asked back.
Yeah. Jolly
That's
good.
great.
Bye.
Did
Thank
you
you,
get
Jeremy.
the recording of